Let's get started. I'm Ishita. I work at Astria. We're building a shared sequencer. And we are going to be talking about building on Celestia, building infrastructure in crypto in general, and some other things for builders to think about. Before we get started, would love to get our panelists to do an intro of yourselves, your project, and what excites you to build in crypto.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kenny, and I'm one of the founders of Manta Network. We're the first general-purpose modularized L2 using Celestia for data availability. We've been building for the past 3 years, no, actually 4 years now, and a team of around 65 people all around the world. And what keeps me interested and continuing to build in this space is I think we're still very far from it, but I do believe that the future of finance has to be globalized, and that globalization requires some level of decentralization rather than some centralized authority. And so I think that we're slowly making steps to achieve that goal, and so I'm excited to be here.
Hola, friends. My name is Zahn. I'm one of the co-founders of Inisha. Inisha is a network for interwoven rollups. We're holistically trying to rebuild how multi-chain networks should look, feel, and operate along the product, architecture, and economic stacks. All of the layer 2s on Inisha use Celestia for DA by default, and we don't use any other DA provider. One of the main reasons that I choose to work in this industry is I think it's just the most entertaining industry to be a part of. And I am terminally addicted to Twitter.com.
Hey everyone, Mike from Lyra here. I'm one of the founders. We build decentralized derivatives, options, perpetuals, and structured products. So we have an OP stack rollup that uses Celestia for DA, which is really good economically. We can talk a little bit about that later. In terms of why I'm excited to build in crypto, I guess, similar to the other panelists, it's a fun place to be. It's never boring. So, definitely keeps me up at night sometimes.
Hi everyone, my name is Nikita. I am one of the co-founders of Barter. Barter started as a solver on CowSwap over 1 year ago, and we are trying to solve a lot of issues that are happening in DeFi and blockchain, including efficient routing, liquidity fragmentation, and MEV, and many more. And I'm excited to build in crypto because, in particular, like in DeFi specifically, because this is such an important market niche. Like whenever we engage with centralized entities and centralized exchanges, market makers, different companies, there are always like unfair advantages and this lack of transparency. And DeFi, addresses a lot of real-world problems, and this is why we feel like we should be doing this.
Hey everyone, my name is Victor. I'm one of the co-founders of Hashflow. For the past few years, Hashflow has been innovating different ways to build trading experiences for user-centric trading experiences to protect traders. And we're continuing our journey. There's more I'm going to talk about later today. But before that, the reason I'm excited to be in this space is because I feel like in this day and age, people are starting to lose trust in software providers and businesses and institutions. And I think that trust has to be rebuilt by, at first, very, very solid software. And I think we're going to start with finance. The work we're doing today is going to start with finance, but it can be expanded to many aspects of social life. And I think what we're doing today is going to be very important tomorrow in that regard. So very excited about that.
Okay, so let's do a few project-specific questions first. For Zahn, Kenny, and Mike, could you get into why it was important for you to pick Celestia for your respective projects? And as more DA layers go live, do you plan on extending support to them?
Sure. So maybe I'll go first. So we were the first, I think, the first general purpose VM using Celestia, and this was during a time when data availability was still very conceptualized, right? I think even today, in terms of liveness, right, only Celestia is purely mainnet, and there's a lot of options out there coming out. I think Avail, Eigenlayer, I don't know if Near is still doing it or not, but there's definitely a lot of optionality here, and honestly, I kind of see a trend of that availability kind of extending from the commodity generation of L2s into potentially the commodity generation of DA. And I think that gives a lot of opportunity for infrastructure players to, rather than sticking to one specific DA solution, looking for alternatives in order to ultimately improve resiliency, right? Even right now when we're using Celestia, one of the things is, one of the safeguards is Ethereum DA fallback. And what that means is essentially if there's any issues with any type of synchronization or uptime on the Celestia side, we still have full fallback to Ethereum, which is still an advantage right now, especially post-proto-dank sharding era. There's not going to be too much of a difference felt by the user financially when they're paying these gas fees. But in the future, I see this very much as an ecosystem of DA layers whereby you have various strategic movements of fallback such that if one goes down, you've still got 2, 3. Maybe you can arbitrage between the prices, optimize for user experience from the financial payment side, right? And so there's a lot of ways to play with that. And so I do see a world where various different DA solutions can be used in order to provide that best-in-class user experience on the infrastructure level.
Nice. Let me give you a quick rundown of Initia's infrastructure and then where Celestia fits in and why. Essentially, on Initia, we have a Cosmos SDK-based layer 1 that acts as the orchestration layer. It orchestrates interoperability, security, liquidity rewards for the network of interwoven rollups on Initia. We have the OP init stack, which is our optimistic rollup framework that's built in the Cosmos SDK. And then layer 2s that are full-fledged Cosmos SDK chains with EVM, MoveVM, and WASM-VM on top. So pick your favorite smart contracting language, change everything about the rollup itself on the SDK side. And then through the layer 1, you're basically given everything you need. And so when we were building out this system, we didn't want to focus on specializing the DA layer or dealing with things like state bloat for the layer 1. It really acts as this orchestration layer. So for all of the rollups on Initia in the future, they need a secure, fast, and safe place to store this data. And Celestia is also a Cosmos SDK chain. So there's a little bit of brotherhood in there. And it's a very easy connection to start posting blobs to Celestia from basically any other Cosmos chain. And so with that in mind, as well as Celestia's NMT design, which allows you to basically have namespaces that are segmented out for different blob sections. For every one of these rollups on Initia, we can create a separate blob area and then post data for that specific subset. And what that allows us to do in the future is if there are things like fraud-proof challenges or scenarios where we need to go and fetch information for a specific rollup, the NMTs really help us when doing so. So we have a feature if there's a rollback where we can state sync from DA and basically rebuild an entire chain state. And we can do that just because of Celestia. And Celestia is, of course, the only live DA. One of the things we wanted to do when building Initia's architecture was remove choice overload. Right now, within the modular landscape, when you're thinking about launching a chain, you have like a goddamn billion options between all these fungible DA layers, like 10 interoperability solutions, all these oracles. And on Initia, we just basically enshrine one good partner from each of these deep into the chain's infrastructure. And then, people don't ever need to make these choices again because it just works. And so Celestia just works for us.
Yeah, cool, thanks. For us, it was really out of necessity. So we built Lyra V2 last year and launched a roll-up in December. I guess a little bit of background on derivatives are quite call data intensive, and we had a protocol which consumed just a ton of data. So when we started posting blocks onto Ethereum L1 in December last year, we ended up losing like 37, maybe 38 ETH in the month. And for us, that's just not viable. I don't think if you've raised 9 figures of capital, you can really run that sort of loss on a monthly basis. So we ended up getting connected with the Celestia team like just before Christmas, and we were like, we got a really big problem that we need to solve really quickly because we can't run this for more than a few months. So ended up moving over and starting to post blobs onto Celestia, and since then pretty happy to report that we've actually been marginally profitable on the sequencer side. So it's been a massive swing from Ethereum L1. I think this was the pre-4844, pre-span batch sort of Ethereum, so it's probably not as bad now, but we are still seeing issues like recently, I think blob space saturated, and you saw big spikes on Arbitrum gas. So the question for us going forward is like, is Ethereum ever going to be able to actually provide a truly scalable, in-house DA solution? And I think the answer to that is probably no. And therefore, something like Celestia has a spot long term in giving teams kind of the space they need to often innovate and add more features. Going back to derivatives again, they are quite call data intensive, and when you're trying to build a system that can rival a centralized counterpart, you're talking about like portfolio margining, 50, 100, 200, maybe 500 different instruments in one account. That's just too much data to post on Ethereum L1, even in the context of blobs. So yeah, we've been really happy since we moved over, and definitely looking forward to continue pushing the boundaries.
So with DYDX leading the charge here, and Lyra is another example, and on the consumer side, we're now seeing some NFT projects that have built up this momentum and now are moving on to their own roll-ups. Would you agree that the app chain thesis is finally coming to life? And what are definitive signs of this, in your opinion? Maybe we can start with Victor.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell because on one side you have technology clearly getting there, right? With the entirety of the modular stack, you can now build things kind of like Kenny was saying. We have like Zom was saying, you have all these choices, right? And you can scale your apps right now somewhat indefinitely, and we see a lot of progress being made in the world of like ZK proof costs and data storage costs, right? So in a sense, yes, it's happening. Like people can build those things, can build chains per app. Now, is adoption there? Do we really have users for all these apps? Do we have issues with liquidity fragmentation? I think there are a few more questions to answer here, but I definitely think that the tech is moving in that direction. Now we just need to see whether these apps materialize in a space where there's active usage, there's practical cryptoeconomic security, and the ecosystem is still running. Like the reality, we still don't have the scale of users for these products that we'd like to have. So what happens over the next few years is going to test all these assumptions.
Well, we love upchain thesis. This is one of the biggest challenges that we personally have, and we are trying to decentralize order matching and routing and make it transparent. No one has done it before on chain, and that's why like Celestia DA is extremely important for us. Right now, market makers on Ethereum blockchain, specifically on the mainnet, have a lot of unfair advantages. Within like 12 seconds of block, the market can shift dramatically, and a lot of transactions have like SEX-DEX arbitrage. And then the exchange of data between nodes is generally like very slow. But with Celestia DA and more upchains and rollups, there must be like a way to analyze the state of different chains more efficiently and connect them and unite them into a single stack of liquidity. So we are trying to explore those different options, and yeah.
I could add something. I think if you can internalize a profitable sequencing model, like it's sort of naturally going to tend towards that end state for every project. The tension there is obviously with composability, and that's pretty important in DeFi because that's where a lot of the magic happens. So I think if we continue to see improvements in asynchronous composability cross-network, cross-L2s, and even cross-L1s, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't end up seeing almost all protocols end up running their own app chains in some way, shape, or form. But that is still a significant technical challenge on the asynchronous composability side. So yeah, it kind of remains to be seen. Obviously, with teams like Conduit and others making it really easy to spin up an app chain or roll up, like you're literally doing it in a few clicks, kind of like you do with AWS. That's also lowering the barrier to entry, which is why we're seeing a ton more app chains than we've seen ever before.
I think there's just a natural tendency of people to want to own their own infrastructure, and this will always be the case. The app chain thesis was prevalent for the last few cycles and will continue to be so now. One of the big differences is the app chain thesis was first created by Cosmos. People would create these Cosmos chains, just for giggles, I think. You have 6 users and 150 chains, not really the best showcase. But nowadays, people, because it's so easy to build app chains, you don't have to run a layer 1, you don't have to inflate your token supply. You can start to get creative when it comes to how this infrastructure actually benefits your application. And there will be a natural transition into owning your own stack. Like once you become big enough, you don't want to leak any value. You want to build things that are unique directly for your customers and your user base, and you want to retain it all. And so I think the app chain thesis will continue to become bigger and bigger. And as we have this modular expansion that makes it easy for anyone to do so, allows people to use different VMs, ensures there's things like composability, removes a lot of the fragmentation and friction when it comes to the UX side, which generally will get better and better as more app chains are being built because people need it and people build what people need. We'll just see this expansion continue to rise. There's basically only 2 ways to scale blockchains. One is make a lightning fast, super scalable, single layer with shared state, and that's the monad hyper mega ETH approach. And that would be like the dream, if that worked. I think if we want to scale to the way we all believe crypto will, we're going to need hundreds of monads. And so let's start knowing that we are going to have thousands and thousands of different chains and just believe in the app chain future from day one and build for it.
Yeah, I think the conclusion of all this is it's not a question of if, it's more so a question of when. And I think the question of when falls under 2 different categories. One that's more controllable by the project itself, and one that is more public-facing. So one that's internal factor of when, and one that's an external factor of when. And the externalities are more so dependent on such, I guess, broader concepts such as interoperability, composability, which was all sort of mentioned here. And I think another question is more so internally facing for the projects themselves, right? And so especially at this point in time that we're currently growing, what we're looking at is essentially, as an application, there's obviously trade-offs, whether you want to do your own app chain versus deploy at first, at least, on an L2. And we've seen these types of transitions with applications where they start off a more of a general purpose L2 and eventually transition into their own L2 once they reach that max velocity. Right? Once they actually have the resource contention and they're starting to see that lag and it's impacting user experience, then you start seeing apps transition into their own app chain. But the question is, do you want to be your own app chain on day one? And I don't know, I don't think, at least not right now, the answer is yes for every single app out there, because you miss out on a lot of different advantages as part of like a broader ecosystem. One is much easier access to a user base, much easier access to liquidity, right? And so there's definitely different trade-offs strategically and in terms of go-to-market strategy when it comes to choosing an app chain versus choosing a general purpose VM and a general more broad ecosystem. But I do think that once you actually start testing out, growing, find that go-to-market, and really need to hit the ground for scalability, then eventually the app chain does come into play and would be a more favorable environment.
That makes sense. So for all of your current projects, when you were thinking about what and where to build, what were some of the other important considerations in terms of infrastructure aside from DA that you all had?
Well, I'm going to start because for us it's slightly different. So we didn't actually, when we decided to build somewhere, we really wanted to showcase the product, right? So we were the first ones that came up with the RFQ model, right? So we wanted to showcase the RFQ model. Now, for us, it was all about liquidity. And I think similar to what Kenny's saying, like the reason you want to use an ecosystem that's already vibrant is because people are already going to be there, right? You have to think of your users. Who's your product going to cater to? And why would these people come to you, right? Typically because they're already there, want to check it out, and it's convenient for them to do so. So that's where we launched RFQ. We launched on Ethereum first. This was back in 2020, 2021. Ethereum was still where everything was happening, and people hadn't really launched these L2s yet. So there were very few chain options to choose from. But for us, building infrastructure, we're cognizant of the fact that from the user perspective, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what chain your app is running on. You don't even want to know. right? Like for us to be able to transition to people who don't know, who are not software engineers, who are not technical, who just want to manage finances, we need them to not have to know. And with that philosophy, we want it to be ubiquitous in that regard. So that's why we worked so hard on pioneering native cross-chain swaps, then native cross-chain swaps between EVM and Solana and so forth, because to us it's so important that all these app chains, no matter what builders do, have a shared liquidity layer, because if they don't, then that's going to make a difference for the user. And at the moment it makes a difference for the user is going to pick a solution which is more centralized, less trustless, and more likely to harm them in the long run.
I'll add to that we've been, our system is a B2B and we are heavily relying on order flow, and we are choosing platforms and protocols where to expand based on the amount of users and market activities there. So we need liquidity as well, just as hash flow, in order to connect routes and make it more efficient and utilize it to the maximum. But at the same time, it's all about community. And whenever we see a spike in user activity on any chain, like we recently expanded into Base, there is a lot of meme coin activity, and there are new unique protocols that are emerging in the ecosystem. And then we can do some of our magic in terms of optimization and connecting them and saving them some tokens. So yeah, user activity and liquidity layer, super important. And of course, we call ourselves an invisible hand of the market, and because the user shouldn't know whether it was barter or where liquidity came from or how, we want to make this process as easy as possible in order to grow DeFi and onboard more and more users and steal them from centralized exchanges.
Yeah, I would agree. I just think it's trying to make things as easy as possible for both developers and users. So on the developer side, EVM compatibility was a must for us. OP Stack gave us that. But then on the user side, trying to get to an end state that does look and feel like a centralized experience. So gas abstraction with Gelato, which we have on Lyra Chain, using Coinbase Wallet as a service to give people other ways to log in a way that's still decentralized and self-custodial, and just starting to knock through things like that to make the end experience for the user as smooth as possible. It's already quite difficult for people to understand DeFi, and then you get into derivatives and structured products, options, all these things. There's enough complexity there on the financial side. You don't want people to also have to jump through hoops just to actually use your product. So yeah, that's kind of how we've been thinking about it. Yeah.
So at Inisha, we had to rebuild a lot of shit. The basic goal was, rebuild all of multi-chain, which is a huge task, obviously. We had the Cosmos ecosystem to look at, but it is, just a horribly executed system of chains. It is ultimately the most flexible stack to build unique blockchains, but the way that it was just put together, came to light, the way things were orchestrated was not done effectively. And so we're, to a sense, building Cosmos Pro Max Plus, which is interesting because one of the biggest problems was you could build these unique blockchains, but you had to build a layer one. You had to deal with the infrastructure that comes with that, the token that you have to create, the inflation that's associated with that, and then how do you connect to all these other blockchains? How do you ensure you have Oracle data? How do you get USDC and CCTP access? How do you use other VMs? What if I'm a builder of Move or a builder of Cosmosm or an EVM builder? And so essentially we rebuilt all those pieces, enshrined them into this system so that users who build blockchains on Inisha or app chains don't have to think about essentially anything but their own application, and then rebuilt the entire product stack around this. Because architecture doesn't just stop there. Your end users are not just the builders, but it's actually the users of these chains too. And that means, what does it look and feel like to actually connect to an app chain? How do you connect EVM wallets or Cosmos wallets or in-app wallets? We built a wallet ourselves that we think is best for the multi-chain world. How do you bridge around all these different blockchains? What does that experience look like? How do I get from point X to point Y, whether that be within Inisha's ecosystem or to an EVM chain or to Aptos or Solana or any of those paths? And then rebuild an entire economic framework around these things that really ties it all together. And so one of the things that we just announced yesterday that we just completed building was a Cosmos SDK module for the Layer 0 team. And what that does is it enshrines Layer 0 omnichain messaging within a Cosmos SDK-based chain. And since all of the rollups on Inisha are Cosmos SDK-based rollups, essentially, despite launching or having EVM, Move, or WASM on top, all of those can come with Layer 0 compatibility, which means you can now onboard from literally any Cosmos chain or any Layer 0 enabled chain, which basically just is all chains. So stuff like that we're just slowly trying to work towards building a new and better multi-chain future.
We're a general purpose L2. I mean, EVM based, right? So it's kind of boring to explain to you why we deployed on Ethereum. But I think one really interesting point for you guys to think about as you figure out where to deploy your applications is, there's obviously EVM, right? Solidity, tried and true bread and butter of the Web3 space. There's alternatives that seem to be stickier, right, like such as SVM. But apart from that, right, there's not really any other options. And I just want to point that out because there are a lot of ecosystems that you can be a big fish in a small pond. But the question is, are those trade-offs essentially worth it? And I think if you look across the timeline of ecosystem development, probably since 2016, 2017, with the explosion of forks of EVM and other Turing complete ecosystems, what you essentially see is a lot of great experimentation that kind of has this boom and bust cycle. And ultimately, the resiliency across all those years have been on Ethereum and EVM-based chains because of the flexibility on the app side. If an L2 goes down, the apps on the L2 will, sorry, when I say L2, I mean specifically on top of Ethereum as an EVM. The apps on the L2 might not suffer as much as if Terra went down, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys are, I don't know how many of you guys don't know Terra, but for those of you that don't know Terra, it was an amazing, amazing ecosystem that had so much promise that just disappeared overnight. Right? And this is the reality for any type of these fringe deployments beyond these larger ecosystems such as the Ethereum ecosystem. And so just something to think about from your perspective as well, because if you are building an application, deploying an application within an ecosystem, your application success is not just tied to your ability to drive users, go to market, et cetera, but it's also going to be tied to the success of the ecosystem itself, right? So, that's something that I think teams starting off tend to underestimate, but it is an extremely important and major driving factor in your ability to fundraise, in your ability to acquire users, in your ability to keep users, drive liquidity, et cetera, yeah.
So, as you were saying, with developers tending to have a better outcome if they pick an ecosystem that already has existing liquidity and a thriving ecosystem, do you think at times developers tend to do that and then kind of miss out on the tech that they actually might be wanting to build on because they're going for just liquidity and a thriving ecosystem?
I think it's a fallacy to say, I want to build on this tech. I think as a project, as a founder, as a business, as any kind of creation that should provide value to the world, your first thought should be, how do I provide the most value to the most people? And then from there, how can I use the existing technologies to achieve that goal, right? It shouldn't be, I'm a, Solana maxi, so I'm going to build on Solana. I mean, Solana's a bad example because it's got a lot of users, so you could probably survive pretty well there. But I'm a Cardano maxi, so I'm going to build on Cardano and then expect 100 million TVL, right? The expectations don't really align there. So I think it's a rabbit hole that a lot of Web3 projects tend to take, but one that I would kind of stray away from and focus more on how do I acquire users to prove out that my product is actually valuable versus how do I over-engineer this and then find out later that no one wants it.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
I think there's just want to kind of reinforce the point that you're making. And I think there's this thing that people tend to do to try to gain relevance, which is try to understand what is going on in the market. What are people talking about, right? Like they're talking about, okay, ZK right now. This is a bad example because ZK is objectively a great thing. But people tend to kind of stick to trends in order to try to attract TVL, try to attract users, and try to attract narratives. And the reality is that, again, if you're trying to build something that holds value long term, the current narrative should not be evaluated based on how many people are talking about it. It should be evaluated based on its soundness, right? So as a founder, as a developer, you have to trust yourself to evaluate objectively the soundness of the current narrative and to ask yourself, do you really think this is going to be a thing in 10 years? And if you think that it's not going to be a thing in 10 years, then I would just stay away and find the thing that's actually going to be there.
Okay. So Nikita, as it relates to some of the topics that were brought up about liquidity fragmentation, so in the last year, you all have been expanding outside of CowSwap and expanding to other protocols and experimenting with a few different things to solve this liquidity fragmentation problem. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, like this discussion made me thinking that, liquidity fragmentation can be good. And can be good in terms of that it brings more innovation, whether there is like AMMs competing with other AMMs, and or whether there are chains that are competing with each other. Moreover, when platforms like ours exist, we try to unite it, and like a very simple example would be if there is like a $10 million Uniswap pool, or there are like 10 AMMs, different AMMs, and $1 million pool in each one of them, it would be probably more efficient to split across, those 10 pools, and the user would get a better rate. So like there are some pros of liquidity fragmentation. However, of course, when we talk about efficiency, this liquidity has to be very competitive. And it has to be composable. So, it should not be laying on some kind of L2 where no one else has access to it. And we need better infrastructure for that. We need more bridges. We need more systems that communicate with each other. In terms of us, yeah, we've started on CowSwap because CowSwap is an amazing sandbox where, it doesn't matter like which solver or which party gets to execute a transaction, as long as user gets the best rate. And we've been trying to achieve it, and the competition is fairly transparent. So yeah, we've started expanding, and again, as I was mentioning before in the beginning of our panel, we are always eyeing chains and ecosystems that have a vast amount of order flow, active trading, and where we can, make a big improvement with our tech. Yeah, we've also had a partnership with Hashflow recently, which we are very happy because RFQ liquidity is superior liquidity on chain. It's has some advantages even to centralized order books, and yeah, like we are super proud to be working with you guys. I'll stop here.
We're proud to be working with you too, by the way.
So on top of liquidity, infra builders have to fight for developer and user attention, which is hard to come by. So how are you all thinking about building a strong community that converts to a dedicated user base? And what factors do you weigh highest in building community? Do you want to start, Kenny?
Okay. It's a tough question. I think it's a very tough question because the reality is there's not too many users in the Web3 space. I was actually on a panel, I think 2 days ago. It doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm thinking so hard about the time, but there were about, I think, 4 other L2s on the panel with me, and it was a whole conversation about L2s and why there's so many and should they exist. And then I asked the audience, which was, I think there were probably like 100-something people in the audience, how many of you guys actually interacted with an L2 in the past day? And 3 people raised their hands, right? So it's like a restaurant with more waiters than customers, right? Like we had more L2s on stage than actual users of L2s in the audience. And I think that's not just an L2 problem. I think that's a general Web3 problem, right? Like the incentives are truly not aligned with the intention of the builders, right? Like I want to build an amazing game that people really enjoy, but you end up becoming the next airdrop farm, right? Like it's you think for some reason because everyone else is doing it and it pumps their numbers and it makes their KPIs look good, and all of a sudden they have 1 million wallet addresses on their app or something, then you got to do that too, right? And it drives us in this wrong direction that incentivizes and encourages Sybil attacking, botting, and all these other things that ultimately don't drive real users. It just keeps us in this echo chamber of bots that continue to either congratulate, which kind of feeds us in the wrong direction, or shame us, right? And so I think in general the problem is there's not enough users. And so, it becomes a very hard task in general to think about, like, how do you quote unquote build community? And I think the answer to that also is, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on the life cycle of your project, right? Like a pre-TGE project versus a post-TGE project has completely different strategies in terms of how to build community. This is coming from firsthand experience in being, both. And so it's a very nuanced answer. I think one of the things, though, right now is the question is, when you're building community, how do you define community, right? Do you define it in sheer numbers, or do you define it in sheer users, or do you define it in sheer token holders? Because all of those have completely different strategies in how to do that. Over at Manta right now, because we are a post-TGE project and we are competing in a heavily contested space, right? Obviously, L2s are heavily contested. And we're all going up against Solana now as well, so whoop-de-doo. But one of the things here is, I think the only tried and true sort of category other than DeFi right now is probably memes. So we're definitely tackling that. Actually, so Bonk is moving over their community to Manta as well. We just made that announcement yesterday. And so that's one of many different actions that we're taking. But in terms of community building, right, like I just kind of wanted to leave you guys some bits to think about because, yeah.
I think it's all about opportunities for wealth creation. That's how you build long-standing communities in crypto. You realize that as a pre-product piece of infrastructure, you're not worth $7 billion at launch. Give people the opportunity to experience upside in your project and what the projects within your ecosystem are building, and ensure they're there along for the ride and can have a piece of ownership that's going to mean something. You are trying to figure out number go up technology. It's not a thing that you can ever promise or properly deliver on. But in crypto, like, this is a hyper-financialized world of everything, and one of your main goals should be aligning early users with high growth potential applications and ensuring you support as many projects as you can that have the potential to do so. Because that's how you actually build communities that stick around within crypto.
I want to push back slightly on that because I think, opportunities for wealth creation is very relevant for, I guess, for you guys, right? Especially because, we're kind of focused on the DeFi sector, and decentralized finance. Finance is, for the purpose of wealth creation, hopefully. But beyond that, right? Like, when it comes to things like GameFi, SocialFi, right? Like, ironically, the underlying value proposition currently is wealth creation, right? Like, I don't think anyone uses friend tech because they love friend tech, right? Like, everyone uses friend tech because they can trade keys and arbitrage and all that other stuff, right? And so, I don't think that in those scenarios it does create actual community. I think it creates a little bit of temporary relevance.
Sure. I think temporary relevance is fine as long as you can have a snowball effect that's going to lead to other opportunities. Right? Like if you look at, you were talking about Terra earlier as being one of the most successful communities. The reason it did that was not only because of Luna, but all of the ecosystem projects that launched, that started low, that gained communities early, happen to gain relevance and grow over time, making these early users a little bit of cash, but also putting them into this community where they can be shared members of other communities. Like, things like memes are amazing for garnering attention, but I don't think they build long-standing communities that are value additive to the products that we're trying to build long-term. Yes, they might help with the number of posts on Twitter related to, Jenny the dog, which is one of our mascots, but not necessarily the best when it comes to actual on-chain users that are contributing to what we're trying to build.
But I think when it comes to wealth creation, right, like, I think that's great for marketing, right? And I think temporary relevance is an amazing step for marketing. But I think the problem, and this isn't like an issue that's specific to any of us, right? I think it's an issue that's more pervasive across the entire Web3 space, is that when we talk about community, I think we conflate that with marketing strategies and temporary relevance quite often. But the reality is that that temporary relevance does not build strong brand commitment, right? And I think we see that a lot across, even DeFi projects. And this is like, if you can offer the best momentary yield, you capture that audience. But they're not going to say, oh, I'm going to stick with, I don't know, Lido, even if Lido only gives me 1% and everything else gives me 4%, right? I think like that movement shows or indicates that, the brand loyalty, which is truly core to the community, is not mature, but rather the marketing for the temporary relevance is extremely powerful as a tool through wealth creation. Yeah.
We are actually at time, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.